I want to address two issues in this video. One is about Dr. Heppenstall, and the other is about the 4-point letter that Parmenter gave to Des. Now, about Dr. Heppenstall, I want to read you some things. They're on the screen of my computer, so I'll be looking up at them. In the Wikipedia article about Heppenstall, it says, one Heppenstall protege would eventually attain special visibility in the church. Heppenstall recognised the talents of Desmond Ford in the mid-1950s. In the early 1960s, they both fought against what they believed to be the excesses and distortions of the Andreasen Robert Brinsmead in his early stage perfectionist theology. But Ford would eventually move beyond Heppenstall in some theological areas that his mentor could not agree with. Heppenstall was disappointed when he failed to dissuade Ford from his position at Glacier View, subsequently writing to him that he was shocked at how far he had swung to the left biblically and doctrinally. Desmond Ford apostatized and left the Adventist church, influenced by Ford. Robert Brinsmead followed suit. The source given for Heppenstall being shocked at how far Des had swung to the left was Dr. George Knight. And in one of his books, he quotes a letter that Dr. Heppenstall sent to Des. In my memory, it was a bit after Glacier View. And again, having done these videos, I've thought a lot about Glacier View, and I wrote on it at Glacier View, which my last video was what I said then. I also wrote on it 18 months later in the Adventist Crisis of Spiritual Identity, which is a pretty rare book. It was typed, and I doubt that there are very many copies left, but I'm thinking of retyping it. And then I wrote on it in 2010 when I was at university, on how Des developed his prophetic views and how it ended up with his being fired. So, and there may be something else that I've written on Glacier View. I keep finding more things. And when you go over these things, new thoughts come into your head. And on the Tuesday afternoon at Glacier View, when Des was answering questions, Dr. Heppenstall, now I won't get the speech exactly right, and I did write this in the Adventist Crisis of Spiritual Identity. I may read that chapter. That may be my next video, and I do hope the last one. But I do want to be thorough. But he stood up and basically said to Des, can't you see the investigative judgment and 1844 in Daniel 7? And in my memory, he had said this to us on the Sunday. And Heppenstall wrote a letter after I wrote this up in the Adventist Crisis and said that I'd misquoted him and I didn't understand what I'd done wrong even then. So I won't be able to work it out now. And Des doesn't remember that meeting with Heppenstall on Sunday. So, you know, it's my word against everybody else. So, where was I going? But it's very clear that that was a very emotional point when Heppenstall said, can't you see it? He made an impassioned appeal. Neil Wilson rushed in to use this to tell Des off. Des felt that he embarrassed him in front of the whole group, and Des picked up his papers and walked off. Now, you see how Dr. Knight has interpreted this because he has a letter. And I think we don't think we've got the correspondence we had with Heppenstall and his wife after Glacier View. It may be that when we're dead and buried, people go through our archive stuff. They might find something, but Des has not seen it. He told me that tonight. So because of that letter, which there must have been a copy of it in Heppenstall's papers. He died in 1994. You would think that Heppenstall didn't agree with Des at all. Now I wonder, Des had talked with Heppenstall many times and got most help on these issues with him. And here's a letter. This is in the Avondale archives. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Somebody, see, I'm looking at the history of it. I wouldn't understand all the theological nuances. Somebody who's good at both history and theology is going to have to look at all of this, and it's going to be very difficult to come to a conclusion. But here's the beginning of this letter, written on November the 3rd, 1979, from Heppenstall. And as I say, it's in the Avondale archives. Yesterday I received a tape on your address interpreting the investigative judgment and Hebrews 9. You express my convictions right down the line. And this is what Des understood, that he and Heppenstall saw the same problems, and later on Heppenstall does list certain points. And certainly the old guard, the right wing, would not approve of Heppenstall's stand on righteousness by faith and perfectionism and the sinful nature of Christ. They would have seen him as part of the problem. But he understood some of the problems in Hebrews, but Des told me at Glacier View that Heppenstall had not done the work that Des had done, and he was partly talking about the work he'd done at Manchester. So he said none of the scholars really understood all the issues that Des was talking about. So this somewhat explains how the scholars could say to us that they agreed with Des, and yet say to the brethren that they didn't agree with Des because they didn't agree on every point. They may not have agreed with his solutions. In fact, a number of people said Des was very, very conservative, and they had gone beyond that. So you have to understand the richness, the complexity of the situation, and not jump down fast on what you see as the solution. For instance, here saying that Heppenstall did not agree with Des. Now, I'll come back, but I want to just mention that Heppenstall died in 1994, and I've mentioned probably in at least one other video that he died of valley fever, which is a virus in the soil. He lived at Carmel, and in that area of California there was this virus that they call valley fever in the soil, and Heppenstall was a great gardener. And I remember after Glacier View we were invited to visit him. He was always very friendly and loving to us. He just sent that one letter particular where he said that Des was lost, meaning he'd not only left Adventism, he'd left Christianity altogether. But you can't just go by that one letter, because Heppenstall's letters to us, sometimes it was as though nothing had ever happened and the friendship was just the same, and then you get an example of a letter like that. But we don't have that correspondence, and whether Heppenstall copied that and these letters are in his papers, I don't know. And I'm pretty sure that Margaret Heppenstall's letters to us, because they supported Good News for years. So for 14 years after Glacier View, There was still a great friendship between us. But it is a difficult situation to fully understand. And I talked to Des about this last night to see if he had any more light. Of course, we've discussed it before. And the only thing we can come up with was that he had the beginnings of this dementia that came to plague him in later life. And Margaret wrote to us, she had rheumatoid arthritis and was quite incapacitated, walked with a stick. And Dr. Heppenstall became difficult in the last years, and she had problems with him. I don't remember the details of it, but that much I know was clear. And it's the only way we can explain that sometimes he appeared to be supporting Des and other times he didn't. And unfortunately, that key moment on Tuesday night, he really helped do for Des. And until I did all this videoing, I didn't fully realise that, because we come to terms with it ourselves. But that night, when Wilson tore into Des, and Luke had come with me that evening, the first time, because I didn't think he'd be interested in the afternoon meetings, and he heard Neil Wilson get down Des's throat and say, "You never listen, here's our senior professor and he's appealing to you and you just don't listen," and so forth. And this was a very shocking and dramatic event. And Herb Douglas, I know, didn't sleep all night. I might get people mixed up, but James Cox, grown men were weeping that night. So that went against Des. Of course it did. So I'm saying this a little bit to say that this is a more complex situation than it appears. Yes, I think when I read my last video, I mentioned Sharon Kine called Heppenstall, and he told her that he'd walked out on the Tuesday night because he was so upset with Des. So it's an absolute fact that he was upset with Des. But he wasn't always upset with Des. And we did have a letter, don't have a copy of it, where he was absolutely furious that they fired Des afterwards. So somebody brighter than me is going to have to sort all this out, and I'm probably the only person who would say what I've said, which is why I feel I need to leave this record. Des said to me tonight, why bother with it all? But that's the historian. You know that if you don't say something or write something, it all gets forgotten. And some of these things were important. That's very hard to understand. So, some of the factors you have to see, as we did, a providence in it all. That Parmenter turned against Des, and you've got the old man in Australia calling him every night. He had Parkinson's. He was shaky. I think it was the beginning of Parkinson's. But, I'm not absolutely sure of that. Eric Magnuson said to me just before he died, Parmenter didn't have the temperament to be president of the Australasian Division. He was a very fine administrator, but he would get red and his blood pressure would go up, and he wasn't moderate in some of these things. Well, that was Eric's point. And of course, when I quote these people, I'm doing it all from memory, so it's very, very hard to completely tell the truth of things. I'm just trying to. So that's one issue. I suspect I'm thinking about it because I mentioned about, or I may not have mentioned, but Ray Cottrell had taken a meeting at Andrews the week before Glacier View, where he essentially said the same thing. Nobody took any notice at all. I think it was to Andrew's faculty, so it wasn't to the general public. But the distinction was that Ray Cottrell was exceedingly loyal to Ellen White, and Des was too, but he did see some of the problems. She used materials from other people, and they were wrong. And theologians and historians know that some of the things that Ellen White said were wrong. It doesn't mean she was a terrible person and that she was lying. Anyway, I won't go into that again. So Ray Cottrell at Glacier View, and afterwards, I think when he wrote up the Spectrum articles from September 1980, which you can get in the Spectrum archives, and I mentioned the Ministry 1980 and said somewhere that that was found in the Spectrum archives, but that Ministry is available in the Ministry archives. I have to keep correcting myself because I'm getting old and forgetful. Another thing that Des told me tonight was that the article written in the Spectrum 1980 is not written by him. It has his name on it, but Ray Cottrell wrote it. Because for some reason Des didn't want to write the article, so Ray wrote it, put Des's name on it. Which is an interesting aside. I mean, Des knows a great deal about what went on, more than I do, but I remember the human interest stuff. Okay, so having looked at that letter, and if anybody wants it, I've mentioned I can send you these things. If you write to me at gford with a number 1 at bigpond.net.au. Now in Spangler's notes, the 4-point letter that was given to Des was mentioned. Now this was a changed version, and I want to tell you, point out how much softer it was. So this would have been written, this was probably not the letter presented to Des on the afternoon, and Spangler says this probably isn't the one. This is the one that probably went into the Ministry magazine. And in our memory, in the original letter, which was pretty harsh, Des had to agree to write in the review and say that not just that he'd shelved his ideas, but that he had changed his mind, no longer believed. This was why he couldn't agree with what Parmenter wanted. There's no way he could have changed his mind. That would have been a lie. And the other point was about Brinsmead. And I want you to notice, I'll read out these 4 points and you'll see Brinsmead is not mentioned. And the other thing is that requirement for change, absolute change, is not in there. Now, what Parmenter said to Des about you've got to change is in Spangler's notes, so we know it's there. And also, if you look at Cottrell's history, or probably Milton's, on the Thursday afternoon when Jack Provencher, who was the medical ethicist that I mentioned on the last video, and I couldn't remember his name, but he was the only brave person to stand up in front of everybody and say that he agreed with Des about the investigative judgment. And he tried to appeal to Parmenter. I can't remember all the details. I haven't been over and looked at it again, so excuse me for that. I'm speaking extempore. But there was a conversation with Parmenter, and he hoped that Parmenter would modify it and come towards Des, basically saying that other people agree with Des, I'm one of them, which was a very brave thing to do, but they couldn't touch him. And one of the things with Des was that he could get an audience. He talked to the common people, and that's one of the reasons they had to silence him. So somebody like Jack Parmenter, who didn't have a following, or Fred Veltman, they were relatively safe. They could have these errant views as long as they didn't talk about them. I mentioned how Neil Wilson said this to Fred Veltman, who went to him and said, "I think like Des." And Fred told Dale Ratzlaff, I think before Glacier View, Dale Ratzlaff came to him and said, "I don't believe in the investigative judgment." Fred Veltman says, "Neither do I, come on in." And in that interchange on the Thursday afternoon, Parmenter makes it very clear that it was not enough to shelve the idea had to be changed, and if you couldn't agree with the fundamental statement, which was Dallas, that they were referring back to, then he shouldn't have to ask for the credentials, the person should hand them back. That was the essence of it. So on the Friday afternoon, it was fairly rough what they said to Des. Even though they were Christians, it was strong, and he didn't see any way out of it. Now listen to this letter, which Spangler has in his notes, and I may have read it out, but I don't remember it. Dear Des, what we really need to know, is there any shift in your position? Are you willing to state clearly and precisely in written form? 1. That you are willing to acknowledge that there are several points in your present position on the doctrine of the sanctuary and related areas and the role of Ellen White that are out of harmony with the fundamental beliefs of the Church, as indicated in the attached paper, not sure what that was, and that in council with your brethren you are prepared to suspend these views in harmony with Spirit of Prophecy Council and make a public statement to this effect. So do you see, suspend these views is very different to change these views. You said before, you can't just shelve these views, but here they say, suspend these views. 2, that from henceforth your teaching and preaching will be in harmony, will be with the fundamental beliefs of the Church as voted in session at Dallas in April 1980. Now remember, the consensus statements are being bypassed. They have gone in advance of the Dallas statement. But unbeknownst to the brethren, the Dallas statement is mentioning, Des has mentioned a couple of things, and you'd have to check on this. But I think I might mention this next time, get it from Des to be exact, the change in the Dallas statement about the little horn as Antichrist, that the judgment was against the wicked, whereas Ellen White, Christ's Object Lessons, said that the investigative judgment, I don't know if that's the term she used, was against the professed people of God. So the righteous. And that change in the Dallas statement was different to traditional Adventism, and the brethren didn't get that. So, and the other thing was, I think, rather than apartments moving from one to another, they used Heppenstall's phases of ministry. So there were changes in the Dallas statement. They said it was quite different, and he'd said that to them. It was different to what they'd said at the time of Fletcher, which I think was in the 1930s. Anyway, historians out there and theologians out there, if you're listening to this old lady, you'll need to check that what I'm saying is correct, because I'm, that's the warning. So Des is judged again on the 10-point statement, which is where, done by the 6, showing where the view in his manuscript is different to traditional Adventism, not the Dallas statement, not the consensus statement, going way back to the pioneers. That's what they used to judge him. Okay, number 3, that because your special views on the sanctuary doctrine and related areas are so widely known, you will indicate your willingness to acknowledge publicly that your PUC lecture and recent manuscript 2 present some areas of doctrine that are out of harmony with the pillars of our faith, and these will be held in abeyance and not discussed, unless at some time in the future they might be found compatible with the positions and beliefs of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So you see the writing of this letter, written after Glacier View and published, and how it has shifted, that his views must be held in abeyance and not discussed. That option was not given to Des on the Friday afternoon. 4, that you are prepared to cooperate with the Church in pen, voice and influence to restore confidence in the fundamental beliefs of the Church, with a desire to restore unity in Christ and his Church. That to this end you will endeavour, as a minister of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, to do what you can to protect the fundamental beliefs of the Church from internal and external attack, and develop an atmosphere of unity, of faith, doctrine and practice. Now, Brinsmead is not mentioned, and yet Brinsmead was, as I say, the elephant in the room. He was mentioned in great detail, but the background was not given. And in this idea of unity, people like the Standish brothers, George Burnside, can't remember when George died, I think he was still alive then, and all his ilk, who was sending material over wherever Des preached, that was never mentioned, the discord and the lack of unity that they caused. You know, Jack Castle, who was the president of PUC, and Eric Magnuson, who was the president of Avondale when Des was there, much of the time, in these years, both said independently they never had any trouble with Des. And Eric Magnuson said to me, when Des was at Avondale, the level of spirituality, the students having prayer meetings, the talk on the campus, he lifted it up so high. But see, he's seen as the cause of all the problems, and he wasn't. So here's the end of it. Des, I know you are a man of integrity. Not enough integrity that they could tell him what John Brinsmead had said. Not enough integrity that they believed John Brinsmead over Des. You know, it seemed to me this was an opportune way, John Brinsmead, in order to fire Des when they couldn't fire Des over the facts. There is no desire on my part to force or coerce you to go against your conscience. I believe in religious freedom. However, while you are being supported by the tithe of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we do not believe it is too much to ask for an indication from you that you will henceforth uphold and teach, preach and write in harmony with the fundamental beliefs which represent the pillars of our faith. Our great desire is to see you preserved for the ministry. I wish I could believe that. I think they wanted him out. And anyway, but for us to help you, there must be some cooperation on your part. We earnestly pray that you'll be able, in all good conscience, to find it in your heart to respond to this letter positively. We await your reply with real concern for you and deep love as your friend and brother in Christ. Yours very sincerely, Keith Parmenter. So it's a beautiful letter, but it's almost, and I hate to impugn the motives, but it's almost as though they've written this letter after the fact to put themselves in the very best light and to give the idea that they did everything they could to keep Des in. And, you know, whether that was accidental or devised, I really don't see that it wasn't devised. Thank you.